What makes us truly understand something, whether it's, the beauty of a painting, the elegance of a scientific theory, or maybe just the way the world works? It's a fundamental question, really, that philosophers have wrestled with for centuries.
Mm-hmm.
And it's right at the heart of the work of the thinker we're exploring today, Edith Lemon-Calisher.
Edith Lemon-Calisher, yeah.
Mhm.
She lived from 1877 to 1951, and she was a really powerful voice in 20th century thought. Her mind was incredibly wide-ranging, tackling these big philosophical questions about art, beauty, what we call aesthetics, but also how we understand value, the nature of consciousness itself, and, well, the very process of knowing.
She wasn't working in isolation, right?
Not at all. She was in deep conversation with some, intellectual giants of her time, figures like Franz Brentano, Georg Simmel, Edmund Husserl.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit. Our mission in this deep dive, then, is to really grasp Landman-Polisher's key contributions to philosophy, particularly her insights into beauty and how we gain knowledge. And it looks like our main guide here will be the entry on her in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Exactly. And what's so interesting about her is that she was working when the boundaries between different fields of study were, well, more fluid than they are now, perhaps. Her work just effortlessly moved between psychology and philosophy, and the study of beauty was closely linked with art history.
Right.
It gives her perspective a really unique flavor, I think.
Okay. So to give our exploration some structure, we'll start by looking at the people and ideas that influenced her life and work. Makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Then we'll dive into her early thinking on what makes an aesthetic judgment meaningful and her ideas about truth in art. And finally, we'll explore her later, more comprehensive doctrine of the beautiful. We're really trying to think like philosophers here, digging deep into these fundamental questions alongside her. Sound good?
Sounds perfect. Let's start by looking at that intellectual landscape she inhabited.
Okay. So Edith Lemon-Calisher was born in Berlin. And it's fascinating that her PhD in 1901 from the University of Zurich focused on the analysis of aesthetic contemplation, looking specifically at painting and sculpture. What struck me is her method. She combined her own observations, her self-observation, with insights from art history.
Right.
And she even acknowledged that her personal experience alone wasn't enough to fully understand the subject.
And that immediately tells us something about her intellectual rigor, even as a budding philosopher, right?
Yeah.
She understood the limits of a purely subjective viewpoint, even when examining something as seemingly personal as our experience of beauty. Her dissertation director, Ernst Muhmann, was important, but so was her engagement with thinkers like Simmel and Stumpf back in Berlin, major figures in sociology and psychology.
Yeah.
She herself said her core interests were philosophy, specifically psychology, and art history, which really highlights that interdisciplinary approach we mentioned earlier.
And her life took her to Switzerland after marrying Julius Landmann, a Swiss economist. Their shared academic life in places like Bern, Basel, and Kiel seems to have been crucial for her intellectual development.
Definitely.
And during this early period, she published those key essays we mentioned on the cognitive value of aesthetic judgments in 1905 and on artistic truth in 1906, followed by her book Philosophy of Values in 1910.
That philosophy of values is particularly insightful because she actually started it with a critical look at Hugo von Münsterberg's work on values. She really challenged his idea of a superpersonal act of will being the basis of value, calling it an arbitrary metaphysical assumption. And she also disagreed with his doctrine of four worlds, the logical, aesthetic, ethical, religious values, and his attempts, which were kind of Kant-inspired, to ground value judgments in the very structure of reality.
So she was questioning the idea that we can justify what we value by pointing to some inherent order in the universe. It sounds like she's pushing us to think more about our direct experience.
Exactly. Landman-Calisher rejected that Kantian approach of trying to locate values in some rational framework of the world. Instead, she focused on what's directly giving to us values as we actually experience them. For her, values are properties of things that we find valuable because they immediately trigger a feeling in us.
Okay.
She drew a really powerful parallel here. We say X is beautiful because of a feeling, much like we say X is red because of a sensation. She argued that both kinds of statements have the same kind of basis in our experience.
That's a really provocative comparison. But how did she distinguish these pure feelings from our everyday emotions, which can be so fleeting and personal? That seems tricky.
That's a crucial distinction for her philosophical project, you're right. She argued that feelings could be pure and disinterested, whereas emotions, by their nature, are always tied to our personal concerns, our desires, our fears. You can really see the influence of Kant's concept of disinterestedness and aesthetic experience here, that idea that we appreciate beauty for its own sake, not for any practical benefit.
Right.
But Lehman-Kalischer grounds this in these primary immediate values that are connected to pure feelings. This was also part of a larger philosophical discussion happening at the time about the role of feelings and emotions, with thinkers like Stumpf and Alexius Meinong also exploring these areas.
And speaking of Meinong, the entry mentions their correspondence and how her work actually influenced his own thinking on value. That really underscores her early impact as a philosopher, doesn't it?
Absolutely. He reportedly said her explanations were the most important for the development of his own ideas on value. She also engaged critically with other important philosophers like Theodore Lipps and Emil Lask. And in her work on How We Know Things epistemology, she drew from people like Heinrich Rickert and Wilhelm Dilthey, who emphasized that we can understand not just general principles, but also the unique characteristics of individuals in specific situations.
So that kind of individual knowledge.
Right. But importantly, she disagreed with the idea that this kind of understanding was somehow limited only to the humanities. She thought it applied more broadly than that.
It sounds like she was constantly in dialogue with the major philosophical ideas of her time, agreeing, disagreeing, sharpening her own perspective through these interactions. And then there's the significant influence of Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology.
Yes, Husserl was a major figure for her, a really big one. She praised his work on the object of consciousness, building on earlier thinkers like Bolzano and Brentano, calling it the most encompassing and most emphatic. She used his idea of fulfillment in her own work, especially regarding the limits of knowing. But she also had some significant criticisms of his idealism, the idea that reality is fundamentally mental.
Right, that mind-dependent view.
Exactly, and what she saw as an artificial separation between consciousness and the real world. Interestingly, she shared with Cassirer, who came from a Kantian background, a focus on the act of knowing as primary, maybe even over the nature of being itself, which was definitely a point of divergence from Husserl.
And then there's Franz Brentano, who seems to have been a really foundational figure for her, especially regarding the objectivity of values.
Indeed. She saw him as a key proponent of the idea that values could be objective, a view she shared, and also for his concept of intentionality, the idea that our consciousness is always directed towards something. However, they differed in some important ways. She located the basis for our value judgments in our feelings, not in our desires, as Brentano tended to do. And while she agreed that value judgments could be objective, she didn't believe this objectivity was immediately obvious through some kind of intuition. Instead, she saw it as something that had to be won, you might say, through experience and by identifying and correcting our errors. So for her, the objectivity of both sensory and value judgments wasn't just given, it was an ongoing process, a task.
Now, the entry also mentions her close association with the poet Stefan George and his circle. That seems like a very different kind of influence compared to the academic philosophers we've been discussing. How did that artistic and literary world shape her philosophical thinking?
It was a very significant part of her life, actually. She attended his seminar, became a devoted follower, and spent many summers as a guest of his family. She even kept a diary of their conversations and anonymously published a book about the essence of his poetry, Georgica.
Wow.
Later, she also wrote about the Swiss writer Karl Spitteler. This deep engagement with the artistic and literary world undoubtedly shaped her thinking on aesthetics and the role of the artist in revealing certain kinds of truths. It definitely broadened her philosophical lens beyond purely abstract arguments.
Which leads us, I guess, to her major work in epistemology, Transcendence of Knowing, published in 1923. The title itself suggests a move beyond the purely internal world of our minds, doesn't it?
Right.
What was her central argument there?
Absolutely. In this work, she argued for what she termed transcendent realism and a realist epistemology. She proposed that the external world is the phenomenon, a kind of fundamental, original phenomenon that provides the very basis, the sense, for our consciousness. She argued that the idea of a subject whose awareness doesn't reach beyond itself is a kind of illusion, even though our intention towards an external object can never be fully realized or fulfilled.
Okay.
She used a really insightful analogy here, comparing the object of a painting to the object of consciousness. Just as the way a painting is presented and what it depicts are inseparable, so too, she argued, are our awareness of an object and the real external object we are aware of. There are even echoes of this, some say, in Heidegger's later concept of being in the world.
That's a powerful way to think about it. So she was critical of both the idealists, who focused only on what's in our minds, the contents of consciousness,
Right.
and the positivists, who only considered what we can directly observe, the appearances.
Exactly. She felt that both of those perspectives fail to adequately account for the way our consciousness inherently points beyond itself, to a reality that exists independently of us. It's noted that even a scholastic philosopher, Eric Prizarra, saw her epistemology as a kind of return to a more traditional philosophical position, albeit one that had been filtered through her experiences in the George Circle.
Interesting connection.
And her ideas even influenced the economist Edgar Salin. Landman Collisher herself acknowledged the impact of her conversations with George on this particular book.
It sounds like her intellectual life was incredibly rich and multi-layered. But the entry also touches on some really profound personal tragedies that she experienced. How did those events impact her and her work?
Yes, in the decade following the publication of Transcendence of Knowing, she faced immense personal loss. The death of her teenage daughter, followed not long after by the suicide of her husband.
Oh, wow.
And then, amidst the rising tide of anti-Semitism in Germany in the 1930s, she experienced painful rejection from the George Circle, which had become increasingly anti-Semitic. This realization, this harsh reality, that it was no longer possible for Jewish people to remain safely in Germany was a major turning point for her, leading her to embrace Zionism.
That must have been an incredibly difficult, shattering period, forcing her to reevaluate so much.
Indeed. She spent much of the 1930s in Basel, finding support and friendship with Gertrude Kantorowicz and Renata von Schalia. But despite these challenges, she continued to lecture and to work on her philosophical ideas, particularly in aesthetics. This culminated in her Fundamentals of a Doctrine of the Beautiful in 1940, which was eventually published after her death as The Doctrine of the Beautiful in 1952. She passed away in 1951.
So even amidst all that personal and political turmoil, she returned to those fundamental questions of beauty. Let's delve into some of her key ideas in aesthetics, starting with that 1905 essay on the cognitive value of aesthetic judgments. What were the core philosophical questions she was grappling with there?
Well, in this essay, she really tackles two central philosophical questions. First, is an aesthetic judgment a form of knowing, a cognitive judgment, in the way that Kant might have understood it? And second, can our judgments about beauty actually have a validity that goes beyond our individual subjective experience? Can they be transsubjective?
Okay.
And her main philosophical strategy for addressing these was to draw these really detailed analogies between how we make judgments about what we sense like color or shape and how we make judgments about what we value like beauty.
And what were the main philosophical points she was trying to establish through these comparisons? What were her core arguments?
She essentially proposed three key philosophical theses. First, that our capacity for aesthetic appreciation or valuation comes from a kind of organ, metaphorically speaking, that functions similarly to our sense organs. Second, that aesthetic judgment has objective validity, or at least the potential for it, on par with sensory judgments. And third, that beauty is a property of things, much like sensory qualities are properties of things. She recognized, of course, that these ideas challenged the prevailing subjectivist views on value at the time. She saw Brentano as a notable exception, someone who also argued for the objectivity of values.
So she was philosophically arguing that when we say something is beautiful, we're not just expressing a personal feeling like, I like this, but we're actually recognizing a real characteristic of that thing, just like we recognize its color or its shape. It's a pretty strong claim.
That's the heart of her philosophical argument, yes. She connected values specifically to feelings, but crucially what she called pure, disinterested feelings, drawing inspiration from Kant's analysis of our judgments of taste. She philosophically rejected the idea that values are rooted in our desires, I want this, or in some abstract ideal standard, this matches the perfect form. Her focus was squarely on these fundamental, immediate values that arise from these pure feelings.
But the obvious philosophical challenge here is the variability of feeling, isn't it? What one person finds beautiful, another might find ugly or just indifferent. How did she, as a philosopher, address that seemingly insurmountable obstacle to objective aesthetic judgment?
She absolutely acknowledged this philosophical problem of the variability of feeling. But she cleverly pointed out that our sensations and even our memories and perceptions are also subject to variability and distortion. Illusions,
Right,
misperceptions.
optical illusions, things like
Yeah,
that.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yet, as philosophers, we still generally accept that some sensations have a kind of law-like relationship to the objects that cause them, and that objective knowledge through our senses is possible, even if we sometimes get it wrong. So, she philosophically argued it would be inconsistent to just dismiss the possibility of a similar kind of objective understanding arising from our feelings, simply because feelings can vary.
Okay, that's a fair point.
She also addressed the historical tendency in science to sort of purge feelings from the realm of knowledge, arguing that just because feelings aren't directly relevant for determining, say, physical causes, or because they were sometimes misinterpreted in animistic explanations of nature, doesn't mean they can't be a source of genuine insight in other domains, like aesthetics. She even countered the philosophical objection that sensory properties are essential for our conceptual understanding of the world in a way that beauty isn't. She pointed out that while color might help us recognize a dog, the value we place on something can be central to our concept of it, like the very concept of a work of art. Value is essential there.
So she was building a really comprehensive philosophical case for treating sensory and aesthetic judgments as fundamentally similar in their potential for objectivity. How did she then tackle the core philosophical question of objective validity itself? How can we be sure our aesthetic judgments are actually true?
Well, she began by noting that both sensory and aesthetic judgments can be expressed in subjective forms, this pleases me, I see blue, and objective forms, this is beautiful, this is blue. As a philosopher, she then explored how subjective unreliability can creep into both domains due to things like our personal biases, emotions getting in the way, distractions, or preconceived notions.
Yeah, makes sense.
She suggested that achieving a high degree of subjective reliability is possible in both through training and experience, learning to see more clearly, perhaps literally, or learning to appreciate art more deeply through education and practice. When it came to the tougher question of objective reliability, she acknowledged the difficulty in directly comparing the external stimuli with our internal aesthetic responses. It's not as straightforward as measuring wavelengths of light. So her philosophical solution was quite ingenious. She proposed a way of theoretically determining the conditions under which our aesthetic judgments are likely to be reliable. By drawing analogies with sensory illusions or deceptions, psychological ones like bias, physiological ones like being tired or ill, and physical ones like bad lighting, and showing how similar kinds of illusions can occur in our aesthetic experiences.
That's a really insightful philosophical approach. So, by understanding why our senses might sometimes mislead us, we can gain a better understanding of why our aesthetic judgments might also be fallible, and perhaps even develop ways to mitigate those errors.
Precisely. And what, philosophically speaking, did she see as the basic criterion for truth in both these types of judgment?
What was it?
For both sensory and aesthetic judgments, her fundamental philosophical criterion for truth was agreement with other judgments. She outlined 4 categories of judgments that indicate agreement in the case of sensory experience, like agreement across different senses, different times, different observers, different conditions, and then presented 4 parallel categories for value judgments. The crucial philosophical point here was that an objective aesthetic judgment isn't based on a single isolated feeling of pleasure, but rather on a consistent pattern of responses to the object under various conditions, and potentially agreement with the judgments of others who are also judging under reliable conditions.
So it's about philosophical consistency and corroboration across different experiences and perhaps perspectives,
Yeah.
rather than just a fleeting personal reaction.
Exactly. She then addressed the apparent tension that aesthetic judgments seem to claim a kind of universality. This is beautiful, implying everyone should agree, that sensory judgments don't always, while at the same time lacking the kind of widespread factual agreement that sensory judgments can sometimes achieve.
Yeah, that's the paradox, right?
Right. Her philosophical explanation for this was that the deeper connection of aesthetic judgments to our fundamental human nature accounts for that aspiration towards universality, while structural factors, individual differences, and the influence of culture and shared human experience, the life of peoples, as she put it, explain the reality of disagreement. Ultimately, she philosophically concluded that widespread agreement isn't the defining criterion for correctness. Instead, it's about the individual truth of individually consistent judgments and the ongoing philosophical investigation into the causes of our aesthetic misjudgments or deceptiveness. This detailed comparison, she argued philosophically, provides a strong justification for understanding beauty as a real property of things, just like their sensory qualities.
It sounds like this early essay laid a really crucial philosophical groundwork for her later explorations into aesthetics. And the entry mentions that her ideas still have relevance for philosophical debates today.
Yes, absolutely. The contemporary philosopher Samantha Mathern, for instance, has highlighted how Lanneman Kalischer's cognitivist and objectivist approach offers a compelling philosophical alternative to more common hedonistic beauty is just pleasure, or Kantian ways of understanding what distinguishes aesthetic experiences and what makes them normative or binding.
Let's move on then to her 1906 essay on artistic truth. How did she, as a philosopher, extend her ideas about truth and judgment into the specific realm of art? What was her philosophical take on what makes art true?
Well, in this essay, her philosophical argument was that while artworks themselves aren't statements or propositions that can be true or false in the usual logical sense,
Hmm.
they do express content that represents a particular kind of reality, namely the reality of our inner mental lives, our psychic reality. And because of this representational function, they can be considered true or false in terms of how faithfully they portray this inner world. She famously said that art mirrors and portrays the mental world. Just as a physical mirror reflects our appearance, art, according to her philosophical view, allows us to see and understand our own inner experiences, making our subjective lives accessible to what she calls outer perception.
So in her philosophical framework, art acts like a mirror for the soul, but maybe with a different aim than something like psychology, which tries to analyze and categorize those inner experiences.
Precisely. She drew a philosophical distinction between art and psychology by saying that art makes inner experience accessible to outer awareness in a direct, sensory way through a medium, while psychology translates these experiences into abstract concepts. In Landman Kalischer's philosophical view, the artist is someone who conveys truths about this realm of psychic reality through the unique medium of their art form, painting, music, poetry, whatever it might be.
And what were the different forms of artistic truth that she, as a philosopher, identified within this framework of art as a mirror of the mind?
She philosophically linked these forms of artistic truth to the three fundamental zones of consciousness: our immediate sensations and perceptions, our memories, and our capacity for imagination or fantasy. She argued that the truth of art in mirroring sensations and perceptions lies in representing them as they appear in our conscious experience, whether that's before or after they've been processed for the purpose of objective knowledge.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think, for example, of a painter who is interested in capturing the full spectrum of colors we actually see, even if we don't consciously register them all in everyday life, or a musician exploring the subtle nuances of sound. She used the classic example of a stick appearing bent when partially submerged in water. Art can truthfully depict that perceptual experience, even though we know intellectually that the stick is straight. Cézanne's landscapes or Rembrandt's compositions were other examples she used to illustrate portraying perceptions as they are in consciousness.
Okay, that makes sense. What about the truth of art in mirroring our memories? Memories can be so subjective and often unreliable in terms of factual accuracy. How did she, as a philosopher, account for that?
That's a key philosophical point she addressed directly. She acknowledged that memories are inherently selective, they often have gaps that we unconsciously fill in, and they are definitely influenced by our desires and emotions. However, her philosophical argument was that art can truthfully depict a memory or the feeling associated with a past event, even if it doesn't align perfectly with an objective, factual account.
Like historical fiction or drama?
Exactly. She used Shakespearean historical tragedies as an example. While they might not be historically accurate in every single detail, they can truthfully capture the emotional essence or the psychological impact of those historical events as they might be remembered or felt. For her philosophical framework, a strong feeling connected to a theme or memory is actually crucial for an artistically true portrayal.
And finally, what about the truth of art in mirroring our fantasy or imagination? That seems like the most open and potentially subjective of the three. How did she philosophically approach that?
It is indeed the most open-ended. She saw the representations of our fantasy as being driven by our feelings, much like our memories, but with the crucial difference that they are consciously or deliberately produced. She considered the fairy tale to be a prime example, maybe even the epitome of this kind of artistic truth.
How so?
Well, in fairy tales, our deepest wishes are often fulfilled, and reality is effectively rewritten in ways that feel psychologically probable, what appears capable of being true within that imagined world, even if it defies the strict laws of the physical world. While in our everyday lives we often seek the extraordinary, fairy tales offer us worlds where things unfold according to our desires, providing a sense of freedom by playfully engaging with the very limitations we often feel powerless against in reality. It satisfies a need.
So, in her philosophical understanding, artistic truth isn't solely about accurately representing external reality, like a photograph might aim to do. It's more about faithfully capturing the rich and complex inner landscape of human experience, our perceptions, our memories, our imaginative lives.
Exactly. And she also philosophically explored how these different kinds of representations are connected within a work of art through what feels probable, like psychological truth in fables, through a sense of necessary or tragic inevitability, like in tragedies and epics, and through the feeling-driven associations we find in simile and metaphor, particularly in lyric poetry, where connections feel true even if they aren't logically strict. She argued that art provides a sense of meaning and interconnectedness to our experiences that reality itself often lacks, almost creating a vision of an unattainable ideal. This, she philosophically believed, satisfies our fundamental intellectual and ethical needs, our deep-seated wish for meaning, and perhaps a sense of moral reassurance. She also touched upon the truth of expressing feelings in art, noting that while we express our feelings in life through our bodies and actions, art often offers a more complete and adequate representation, maybe because it's freed from the social and ethical constraints that can inhibit our spontaneous emotional expression in everyday situations. Art can fill that need.
It's remarkable how she, as a philosopher, weaves together these different facets of human consciousness and their manifestation in art. This really sets the stage for her later, more comprehensive work, The Doctrine of the Beautiful. What were some of the key philosophical ideas she developed in that magnum opus?
The Doctrine of the Beautiful truly represents her mature and most comprehensive philosophical thinking on aesthetics. It's quite something. She begins in the first chapter by philosophically considering the place of beauty in the world. She echoes the spirit of Goethe, actually, in her emphasis on the ancient Greek idea that beauty arises from the harmonious interplay of opposing forces in nature.
Harmony from conflict.
In a way, yes. She views the human being as both the supreme creation of nature and the creator of art, the true and primary home, the primal place of the highest forms of beauty. For her philosophical view, beauty is actually intensified when it involves more powerful and antagonistic forces that are successfully brought into a state of harmony. She even offers the striking philosophical insight: beauty would not be beautiful were it not difficult, were it not a victory.
Wow.
Yet this victory, paradoxically, is one that is achieved without violence, through a free and unforced, almost natural-seeming ordering.
So, philosophically, beauty isn't just about superficial pleasantness or a lack of tension, but rather about the successful resolution of inherent challenges and the achievement of a profound kind of balance. Like, the more tension resolved, the greater the beauty.
Precisely, that's a great way to put it. Philosophically, she identifies fundamental forms of harmony that correspond to different realms of existence. Formal harmony, like measure, proportion, symmetry; organic harmony, found in plants and animals; human harmony, cosmic harmony; and of course, artistic harmony. While she acknowledges the philosophical connection between beauty and robustness or vitality, she also cautions that the inherent complexity of life means that not everything that lives achieves perfect harmony or beauty in all its aspects. She even refines Schiller's idea about play, suggesting that animals can only truly be considered beautiful when they are engaged in play, when they are not simply driven by unmet needs or raw instincts.
And what about human beauty specifically? As a philosopher, did she have particular insights into what constitutes human beauty beyond just the physical?
She did, very much so. She philosophically argues that the human body is just as essential to human beauty as the soul, rejecting any philosophical approaches that might prioritize the spiritual while neglecting the physical form. However, she also fondly states that where no spirit animates it, no body is beautiful.
So spirit is key.
Absolutely. She emphasizes the philosophically significant role of our inner life, our spirit, in how we perceive beauty. She believes that things like humility and a respect for the spiritual world actually have a beautifying influence. For her philosophical view, spiritual beauty is superior to mere animal or physical attractiveness, and a strong and virtuous spirit can even triumph over an outwardly plain or unattractive body. She uses Socrates as a compelling philosophical example of this.
Right, the famously ugly philosopher.
Exactly. She then lays out three philosophical principles related to beauty as a property of a particular subject. First, that every species must exhibit internal consistency, it must agree with itself to be considered beautiful, meaning you can't judge a cat by dog standards, for example. Second, that every individual example must correspond in some way to the norm or ideal of its species. And third, that the height or degree of beauty is directly related to the level of complexity and development of the species. Higher life forms have the potential for higher beauty, but also a greater risk of ugliness.
Interesting.
She emphasizes that all true human beauty is ultimately rooted in the beauty of the human spirit, which requires harmonious integration of all our cognitive, volitional, conscious, and unconscious capacities. She philosophically laments what she sees as the modern loss of the true content, of the ideal of the beautiful soul, which she feels got lumped in with mere sentimentality after classicism and romanticism. She calls for a return to measure and harmony, echoing the classical Greek ideal of kalligathos, the unity of the good and the beautiful.
And this spiritual beauty isn't static, is it?
No, it unfolds in life through actions, omissions, even how one faces fate. And the degree of beauty, again, is a function of how disparate or powerful the forces are that achieve harmony. Supreme spiritual beauty, she believes, stamps human beauty.
She also philosophically considers how human beauty varies across different ages, genders, and cultures. What were her philosophical insights there?
Yes, while acknowledging the biological differences often associated with age and gender, she philosophically emphasizes how the beauty of the spirit can transcend these physical distinctions. Regarding cultural variations, she argues that her philosophical concept of beauty as harmony allows for a vast diversity of beautiful forms. As many types of beauty as there are types of human beings, she says. Yet she also controversially proposes a kind of approximation to an absolute human beauty using classical Greek ideals, like the Idolino sculpture, as a benchmark, comparing it somewhat unfavorably to a Chola bronze figure. This comparison frankly reflects a potentially problematic, maybe Eurocentric element in her thinking, despite her overall homage to Greek ideals.
Yeah, that's worth noting. Okay, in the second chapter of The Doctrine of the Beautiful, she turns her philosophical attention to the creation of beauty in art. How does she, as a philosopher, understand the role of the artist in this process, building on what she said earlier?
She philosophically views artists as creators of even more intricate and complex forms of harmony than we typically find in nature, precisely because they are expressing the beauty of the human spirit through sensory mediums. She revisits her earlier philosophical idea of art as a mirror, suggesting that just as nature finds its reflection in the human spirit, the artist creates a reflection of human beauty in their art. She identifies two fundamental constraints that shape the artist's work. First, the necessity of using some kind of material substance, what she calls the phenomenon of art, the primal phenomenon. And second, the focus on engaging a singular sense modality, like sight in painting, we are all eyes, or hearing in music, all ears.
And what are the essential philosophical elements of artistic beauty, according to her mature aesthetic theory? She mentioned this earlier, but how does she flesh it out here?
She philosophically outlines three equally essential elements. First, formal beauty, which encompasses the beauty of the forms themselves and their organization within the artwork. Things like symmetry, proportions, color harmony, rhythm, rhyme, meter. Second, artisanal beauty, which refers to the skill and technical mastery of the artist in working with their chosen medium, the craftsmanship involved. And third, artistic content, or Gehalt, which she sees as the inseparable unity of the object being portrayed and the artist's unique expression or perspective on it. These three have to work together.
And it's the unity that's key.
Exactly. She philosophically argues that formal and artisanal beauty lose their significance if they become the ultimate aim of the artwork, art for art's sake, in a superficial way. And conversely, the artistic content, the Gehalt, is diminished if the artistic means, the form and craft, become invisible or disappear entirely into the subject matter, leading towards simple naturalism or raw expressionism. For her philosophical view, the true artistic object is a unified whole, a unity of the eye and the world, and artistic beauty emerges from the harmonious integration of these three elements: form, craft, and content. She critiques traditional philosophical views of art as either mere imitation, mimesis, or purely an expression of inner feelings, arguing that these perspectives mistakenly focus on only one aspect of the complete artistic phenomenon. She then goes on to offer a philosophical examination of beauty in specific art forms like poetry, painting, sculpture, music, and architecture, applying this three-part framework to each.
Okay. The third chapter delves into the grasp of the beautiful in the sense for beauty. How does she, as a philosopher, describe our subjective experience of encountering beauty? What's happening within us?
She philosophically emphasizes aesthetic intuition as a form of empathetic understanding, almost like understanding from within. The beautiful object stirs a resonance of our soul, she says. We intuitively grasp even the simplest forms as carrying meaningful expression. For example, we experience music not just as a series of sounds, but perhaps as the song of a soul. We might attribute human feeling even to the sounds of birds or instruments.
So we project our feelings onto the object.
Not exactly project in a simple way. She philosophically notes that we perceive our own feeling dwelling in the intuited object, but crucially, this feeling is transformed in the process. It's no longer a purely personal, subjective emotion. It's now objectified, expressed through another medium. While the feeling of beauty itself is a real and potentially important experience for us, the joy or sorrow we empathize with in a beautiful artwork is not our own immediate actual feeling. It's a represented feeling, one that is detached from our personal concerns and interests.
Ah, that's the disinterestedness again.
Precisely. She also philosophically highlights the way in which the aesthetic object is removed from the immediate reality surrounding it. A painting on a canvas is not simply that piece of fabric. Insofar as it is a work of art, she says, it is not this little piece of canvas. It exists in a different kind of space. He draws again from Schiller here to describe the aesthetic state of mind as a kind of play that is also deadly serious, arguing that beauty alone has the philosophical power to separate us from the inhuman.
Interesting. She connects beauty and humanity very strongly.
Very strongly. She even philosophically refuses to draw a sharp line between the ethical and aesthetic effects of art, seeing supreme human possibilities revealed in the serious play of art. She concludes this chapter by reiterating her earlier philosophical arguments about the cognitive value of aesthetic judgment. Despite the diversity of individual opinions, she asserts, true beauty must be philosophically assumed to exist objectively and in principle to be knowable.
Okay. Finally, the last chapter explores the place of beauty in the realm of values. How does she, as a philosopher, position beauty in relation to other fundamental values like the holy, the true, and the good? This seems like a culmination of her thought.
It really is. She philosophically distinguishes between what she calls self-centered, almost animalistic values, things that are merely pleasing or useful to us individually, and objectively valid cultural values. Among these cultural values, she places the holy as the original and foundational form, the primeval root from which the other cultural values, truth, goodness, and beauty, ultimately arise. She sees religion, historically, as the cradle of all culture, initially nurturing these other values within its framework.
And not the state.
Interestingly, no. She philosophically argues that the state, in its purely political sense, does not belong to these core cultural values, despite the historical unity often found between religious and political life in early societies. She contends that both religion and art spring from the holy in the primal sense, and while reason, particularly in what she calls the ages of enlightenment, vainly attempts to replace the holy with the good or the true as the ultimate foundation, she believes that only art can give back the complete feeling of the holy.
Wow, that's a strong claim for art.
It is. She then philosophically examines the relationship of these values across different historical periods, identifying religious ages, like the Middle Ages, rational ages, like the Enlightenment, and artistic ages, like ancient Greece, the Renaissance, Elizabethan England, German classicism. Though she emphasizes that these are never mutually exclusive stages, but rather different facets or emphases within human existence, both individual and collective. She sees art as playing a crucial role in the development of a complete human being, fostering a harmonious balance of all our capacities, warning that a one-sided pursuit of any single value sacrifices this completeness. Measure, she argues, is found only in art's harmonious development.
And what about the specific philosophical relationship she draws between art and religion, given they both spring from the holy?
She philosophically argues that art, like other fundamental values, has its origins in the realm of the holy. However, while many religions were primarily shaped by metaphysical doctrines or strict ethical codes, she sees the Greek religion as uniquely poetic. She points out that the poets themselves effectively gave the Greeks their gods, portraying them as sublime human figures, and the muses themselves were goddesses. The Greeks, in her philosophical view, achieved a remarkable assimilation of religion and poetry, mutually enriching both.
And she contrasts this with other traditions.
Yes, she contrasts this with more ethical philosophical religions like Mosaic law with its prohibitions against images, or ascetic philosophical traditions that might devalue the sensory world. She suggests that religions focus primarily on the afterlife or another world, risk neglecting art and the appreciation of beauty in this world. She sees the primal human experience, or Leibniz, of fear of the unknown as the foundation of religion, which often uses means of coercion, as she puts it, rituals, doctrines to alleviate these fears and fulfill desires. Art, on the other hand, makes no such promises and is accessible even to those not overwhelmed by fear. It offers a different kind of redemption, opening up a new world, the world of beauty, in which wishes grow silent.
A different kind of salvation almost.
Perhaps. While religion seeks to overcome disharmony with the promise of another world, art's piety, she says, is directed towards this world, seeking to overcome disharmony through the beauty of the world that it shows. She sees a contrast between the anxiousness inherent in religion and the artist's brave trust in their own feelings. Philosophically, however, she notes that it is often difficult for art, which operates in a higher zone of consciousness, to maintain its standing against religion, partly because negative fear is always stronger than positive joy.
And finally, how does she, as a philosopher, analyze the relationship between beauty and the values of reason, truth, and goodness? This seems like a central tension in Western thought.
It is, and she traces this historical and philosophical tension meticulously. She notes how art has frequently been called before the tribunal of reason, from ancient times, Plato, Aristotle, through the Enlightenment. It's often been relegated to the status of mere amusement, or a tool for moral instruction, or seen as subordinate to the demands of the good, like in Plotinus or Augustine, or the true. Christian thought sometimes held worldly beauty in contempt, and the pursuit of truth often battled against beauty's allure.
So reason often tried to dominate beauty.
Yes. While poetry and art initially align with the Enlightenment's push against otherworldly concerns in the 17th century, reason's expansion eventually alienated it from beauty. Aesthetic feelings were seen as uncertain or primitive gropings, art sometimes dismissed as delectatio puerilis, childish delight, and thinkers like Rousseau even expressed a kind of guilty conscience about aesthetic pleasure.
But she saw a counter-movement.
Definitely. She highlights the important contributions of German writers like Goethe and Schiller in philosophically reasserting the intrinsic value of beauty. Schiller, she notes, even argued for the supremacy of the beautiful over the good. The question of its supremacy over the true was more complex for Goethe and Schiller, who initially saw truth as art's source or goal, but later came to see art as a way of engaging with the world not beneath, but above reason.
And philosophers followed.
Some approximated this view. Kant, for example, recognized a distinct realm of pure aesthetic feeling alongside understanding, truth, and will, goodness. However, she argues that later idealists like Hegel and Schelling ultimately championed the Enlightenment's tendency to subordinate art to philosophy. Landemann Kalischer passionately calls for a return to a more Goethean spirit, as exemplified in the work of Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and her contemporary Stefan George, to achieve a kind of overcoming of the purely abstract true through the concrete power of the beautiful.
How did she critique Hegel specifically?
She philosophically critiques Hegel's unproven assertion of the interiority of spirit as a basis for placing philosophy above art, seeing this as an absolutizing of historical consciousness. She argues forcefully that the beautiful achieves a kind of truth by realizing it in concrete intellectual intuitions, rather than in abstract concepts. For her philosophical view, knowledge alone is incomplete. It is only the activity of a part of our being. The person who acts and creates, who fully embodies their being in the world, encompasses more than the person who merely knows abstractly.
So knowing isn't the whole picture.
Not at all. While truth is the highest value within the realm of reason, she philosophically argues that what truth it should seek is not subject to its jurisdiction alone. She points to the inherent limits of truth and its dependency on other values, like beauty and goodness. She's careful to say she's not proposing a rejection of the achievements of reason, but rather opposing its claim to be the sole director of human life.
And intuition plays a key role here.
Absolutely. She emphasizes the transcendent character of knowledge. It's always directed towards objects that are never fully given, implying that our cognitive functions aren't self-sufficient and rely fundamentally on intuition. Intuition, both intellectual and sensory, which she calls artistic or aesthetic, is presented as an essential and higher form of knowing that grasps, holds the world, or a concrete thing in a way abstract reason cannot. She quotes Schopenhauer approvingly, stating that wisdom lies in intuitive grasp, not abstract knowledge. At the highest point of knowledge, she suggests, the thinker gives way to the artist. True insight is found in the concrete truths of poetry. She even boldly claims, poetry is not only more philosophical than history, it is more philosophical than philosophy itself.
Wow. And finally, what is her philosophical perspective on the relationship between beauty and the good? How does she connect aesthetics and ethics?
Here, she takes her primary bearings from Schiller, moving beyond the Kantian notion of a fundamental conflict between our moral duty, reason, and our inclinations, sensibility. She sees beauty as possessing a holistic character that transcends the limited scope of a purely rational conception of the good. For her, the rational good alone isn't fully incorporated within the larger realm of beauty. Beauty, in her philosophical framework, actually perfects both our sensuality and our rationality, leading to a state of reconciliation and harmony between them, which is itself the path to true freedom.
A harmony between reason and feeling.
Exactly. She draws an affinity between Schiller's concept of the beautiful soul, a disposition characterized by a natural inclination towards the good, where duty and desire align, and the ancient Greek ideal of virtue, arete. She offers a profound philosophical insight. If we make a human good from within, he becomes beautiful. If we make him beautiful on the inside, he becomes good, suggesting a deep, almost reciprocal interconnectedness between these two fundamental values.
So beauty isn't just a means to other ends.
Absolutely not. She emphatically rejects the idea that beauty is merely a means to achieving other values, like truth or goodness. For her, the entire system of values appears in its most complete and internally interconnected form only within the experience of beauty. All other values, she argues quite radically, are ultimately abstracta. They are values only of specific properties or aspects that only become fully concrete and meaningful through the overarching value that attaches to the whole being, and that value is beauty itself.
This has been an incredibly rich and really thought-provoking deep dive into the philosophical world of Edith Landman Kalischer. She clearly possessed such a deep and multifaceted understanding of aesthetics, artistic truth, and these intricate relationships between beauty and other core aspects of human experience and knowledge. Her work really does challenge us to think like philosophers, doesn't it? To grapple with these fundamental questions in new ways.
Absolutely. Her interdisciplinary approach, bridging philosophy, psychology, art history, and her profound engagement with the major philosophical movements of her time, phenomenology, neo-Kantianism, value theory, allowed her to develop truly nuanced and insightful perspectives that, as we've seen, continue to hold significant relevance for philosophical inquiry today. She really forces you to reconsider things.
So as we bring this philosophical exploration to a close, here's maybe a final question for our listeners to ponder. How might Landman Kalischer's emphasis on the deep interconnectedness of beauty and other fundamental values, truth, goodness, the holy, reshape our own understanding and appreciation of art, knowledge, and ethics in our contemporary world? Or perhaps, considering her powerful critique of the dominance of reason, how might we reevaluate the crucial role of aesthetic intuition, that empathetic grasp she talks about, in our ongoing pursuit of understanding? These are the kinds of questions I think that continue to drive philosophical inquiry.
Those are essential questions for anyone interested in thinking philosophically about the world, definitely. And if this deep dive has sparked your intellectual curiosity, we strongly encourage you to delve further into Landman Kalischer's own writings. Perhaps starting with those early essays we discussed, or tackling her magnum opus, The Doctrine of the Beautiful, to explore these fascinating philosophical landscapes for yourself. There's a lot more there.